Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This is another episode in which I gather together Cornish folklore, which will eventually be edited into a single document to provide a gazetteer for the Cornwall area for Ars Magica 5th edition. I had thought that I had completed my initial research. I have even started the drafting stage if you go to the website that accompanies the podcast. And then I discovered that the reason that there were a couple of folktales that kept showing up that I couldn't find original sources for was because Richard Hunt, whose works we've covered in some of the earlier episodes, had a researcher who also released his own book. So in this episode and in the Cornwall episode for next month, I'll be covering Bottrell's Traditions and Hearthside Stories of Western Cornwall. We'll cover Volume 1 today and Volumes 2 and 3 next month. The reason Volumes 2 and 3 can go together is because the folktales they contained were covered in some detail because he had given them to Hunt, and so they've turned up in previous episodes. The material in this episode is somewhat raw. It will need to be boiled down a little before it is put into the final document. Bottrell's colour text is a lot better than Hunt's. For example, all of the descendants of Jack the Giant Killer in Cornwall are shaggy because their mother used goats as midwives in Bottrell, but not in Hunt. That being said, because mentally I'd prepared myself to move on to the next stage, I'm fossicking very lightly in Bottrell. There's a chance that some future Ars Magica author is going to scoop in on this research and use it to rewrite the book on Stonehenge. If they do, a bit of guidance. Hello, visitor from the future. You might want to spade through Bottrell again because I'm well past my self-imposed deadline here, and I've skimmed the material rather faster than any sensible author would, just to pick up the obvious bits. Oh, and good luck. But now on to the notes. An obvious treasure. This is a quotation from Bottrell. Every now and then, down to the present time, many persons have dug all around the cairns of tree corn on moonshiny nights in the hopes of finding the crocks of gold that the giant buried there. But whenever they dig so deep as to touch the flat stone that covers the mouth of the crock, and hear it ringing hollow, then out of the crevices of the rocks and the cairns come troops of frightful-looking spriggans who raise such direful weather that it scares the diggers away. Contested Vsauce, maybe? A stopping place for the Mercure, or a ferry inn. He was of an ancient family that came from Normandy and settled in Sennen soon after the conquest. They held their lands, 'tis said, as a gift from the conqueror. The two oldest branches of the family terminated in daughters who gave themselves and their lands to other names, but at the time they had not much to bestow, as the first and last in England belonged to them, and for many generations, and they could do no less, they thought, than be their best customers at their own hotel. The Peller was mentioned briefly in Hunt. He's a local folk magician. His practices are described in far more detail in Bottrell. Some of them are from later in the period, but the annual renewal of his charms seems like a useful plot hook. And now to the quotation. According to ancient usage, the folks from many parts of the West Country would make their annual pilgrimage to some white witch of repute for the sake of having what they call their protection renewed. The spring's chosen for this object because it's believed that when the sun is returning, the Peller has more power to protect them from bad luck than in any other season. There used to be rare fun in all the folks going to the conjurer in the spring, when they were sure to meet at the wise man's abode, persons of all ages and conditions from many a great distance. Then the inhabitants of the Scilly Isles came over in crowds for the purpose of consulting the White Witches of Cornwall, that they may obtain their protection, charms, spells, and counterspells. Many of the captains of vessels belonging to Hale, St. Ives, and Swansea often visited the Peller before they undertook a voyage, so that with seamen and tinners there was sure to be a great variety in the company. The conjurer received all the people and their offerings singly in a room, by courtesy styled the hull, or hall. Few remained closeted with him more than half an hour, during which time some were provided with bags of earth, or teeth, or bones, taken from a grave. These precious relics were worn, suspended from the neck, for the cure or prevention of fits and other mysterious complaints supposed to be brought on by witchcraft. Others were furnished with a scrap of parchment on which was written the abracadabra, or the following charm, Saetor Ripo Tenet Opera Rotas. These charms were enclosed in a paper, folded like a valentine, sealed and suspended from the neck of the ill-wished or spellbound or the ailing person, The last charm is thought of as an instrument of great power because the magical words read the same backwards as forwards. A gritty substance called witch powder that looked very much like pounded brick was also given to those who required it. An aged crone of the Peller blood, a mother or a sister, received some of the women upstairs to cure the least difficult of the cases, such as simple charming would effect, but the greatest part of them preferred the man, as his charms were the more powerful, to unwitch them. Instead of the earthy powder, some are furnished with a written charm, which varies according to the feelings of the recipients. Some are religious folk and have a verse of scripture, concluded with comfortable assurance that with the help of the Lord the White Witch hoped to do them good. But those with no particular religious sentiments he furnishes with a charm, which the following is a literal copy. On one side of the paper, about 1/2 inch by 1 inch, is Nalga, N-A-L-G-A-H. Here follows a picture of what might be the conjurer's own creation. Such an object was never seen by mortal eyes in the heavens above, the earth below, nor in the waters under the earth. The only object we can compare it to is something which is a cross between a headless cherub and a spread eagle. Underneath, what might have been intended for an angel or a bird is an egg, which the creature seems to be brooding. There's another egg at the extremity of its outstretched legs. This picture, which is the singular part of the charm, can only be represented with the aid of a pencil. The word tetragrammaton is under it on the reverse. Jehovah, Yah Elohim, Shaddai Adonai, have mercy on a poor woman. From the worn condition of the charm, which had been in use many years before it came into our hands, it's difficult to make out the writing. Another amulet, which is commonly given by the Peller to his patients to be worn suspended from the neck, is a bag of earth from a man's grave. Beside the above-mentioned precious charms, he gives the neophytes powders to throw over their children or cattle to preserve them from witchcraft, ample directions as to lucky and unlucky times, and a green salve said to be excellent healing ointment. I've talked to many who visited the Peller each spring for years running, that they might get their protection renewed. Yet there is no finding out all that takes place at the time of this pilgrimage, as the directions given each individual are separate, and they are bound to preserve the greatest secrecy about some portion of the charm, or it'll do no good. Others are supplied with bloodstones, millpreaves, snake stones, or other trumpery, manufactured by the Peller's family to be worn as amulets. Blue stone rings, in which some fancied they saw an adder, or when marked with yellow veins the patterns of a snake, are particularly prized, because it's believed that those who wore them are safe from any armed reptile of the serpent tribe. Any man or beast bitten, envenomed, given some water to drink wherein this stone had been infused, would recover perfectly from the poison. The amulets, reliquaries, and charms supplied by the White Witch serve to tranquilize the diseased fancy, as well as the bread pills, coloured waters, and other innocent compounds of more fashionable practitioners, or the holy medals and scapulars of their professors. There are no new notions under the sun, the only difference is the fashion in which they're disguised. There is a quote from a witch I'm keeping, because it shows the method used to discourage the devil in local white magic. After taking a good drink of the brandy, she said, "Don't you be frightened, even if you happen to see old Nick. Perhaps it would be well to tie a neckerchief over your eyes, because often, in spite of all my charms, mystifications, conjurations, toxifications, incantations, fumigations, tarnations, develations, and damnations, beside all the other ations ever known to the most learned parson or conjurer, the devil will often be here trying to catch the spirits, and the sight of his saucer eyes of fire, ugly horns, and cloven hoof is enough to fright one to fits. Oh, and the smell of the brimstone he brings along with him is enough to poison one. You aren't afraid, are you, that you're trembling so?" Each of the witch's ations could, of course, be a folk charm against a type of fairy. A fairy trick. Before the good men came home from work, they, their wives, would be sure to go to gossip a bit while the cake was baking. Then Bucka would sneak in, carry off the cake, and place a turf under the bake pan carefully covered with fire again. When the gossip came to take a nice bit, she might be heard to exclaim, "Well, I never thought I'd been out so long. My cake's been burnt to ashes." There we note the fairy desire for leavened bread. And then there's a lengthy story, Basava, the demon mason, and Lenny the cobbler. It's got a couple of monsters to sort out and a contagious infernal aura. Most Cornish scholars agree that the name is composed of Bos, house, and Avel, apple, which signifies the orchard house. The common saying in this neighbour is that Basava was the first house built after the flood. They regard it as the most ancient inhabitation in the Vale. Little more than a century ago, just below Basava Mill, the ruins of a very old house might be seen. It was much larger than any other glen dwelling, and of superior masonry to anything seen elsewhere except for the churches. In accordance with the usual habit of simple primitive folks to assign a supernatural agent to the cause of any extraordinary performance, this dwelling was ascribed to a demon mason who engaged to build a house of better workmanship than ever seen before, for an old miserly cobbler named Lenny on the usual conditions, that the employer was to depart with the demon craftsman at a stated time and then serve him. They say that one of the boots that Lenny made for the dark gentleman was bigger than the other to hide his cloven foot. No one, except the old cobbler, knew where the dark silent workman came from, nor was it known where he departed. Yet, in a short space of time, the building was completed, all the walling done in the good old-fashioned style of rubble work. There is some detail here of the construction of the house. Old Lenny enjoyed the house in his dismal way for many years after it had been finished, in all respects according to the contract by the honest mason devil. The term was drawing near to a close in which it had been agreed old Lenny was to live in his grand mansion before he had to pay the builder, yet he didn't think much about it and hammered away at his lapstone as if he didn't care a cobbler's cuss for what was to come. At last the term expired, and the cloven-hooded craftsman, whose name is never mentioned, returned to claim his own, to take his ancient employer with him. When he arrived, he found old Lenny mending a pair of shoes for some neighbour. The cobbler desired his visitor, who was for immediate departure, to let him finish the job, and the inch of candle remaining, stuck in the edge of the window-seat, that it might not be wasted before they started together. The good-natured simple devil consented, and when he turned his back for a moment, the old cobbler blew out the candle and placed it in a Bible. The devil, as one may expect, was much enraged at having found himself fooled by the old miser, and declared that from that time old Lenny should never sleep with a whole roof on his house, nor anybody else after him, so he would find himself worse off than if he were to go then like a man of his word. The cobbler swore, roof or no roof, that he would remain in his house, as long as one stone stood on another. The cockcrow made the devil flee, but as he left he raised a whirlwind that blew all the thatch from one side of the roof. The cobbler didn't mind that. As soon as the devil departed, he cast the candle in tin that it might always be safe. The story then eventually peters out. The demon keeps destroying the roof. Lenny's ghost haunts the place after he dies because he said he'll stay there until there's no stone upon stone. Eventually the miller, who's tired of them fighting every night, gets a parson to come and send the demonic mason away, which does work, but Lenny, even though he is exorcised, comes back a few nights later, and he's still there. The local people have reused the stone from the house, but they only ever use it for hedges and outhouses. They don't put it in their own dwelling house because they're worried that the ghost of the cobbler may start appearing next to their hearth. Bottrell goes into a great deal of detail about the internal contents of a particular house here. It's not of interest to us, except that it's large and it has a secret room which can be detected by putting towels in the windows, much like Glamis Castle. Bottrell also gives a traditional recipe for mead. It includes brandy, which means that it's later than the 1220 period. It reminds me of the Sherlock Holmes story written by Neil Gaiman, where the boiling of combs for their honey was of great importance. I also think the floating egg that's coming is a lovely touch. It could be of his source. The old method of making mead, or metheglin, in West Cornwall was to put 4 pounds of honey in 1 gallon of water and boil it for an hour, and then skim it well, and then add an ounce of hops to every gallon, and boil it for half an hour longer, and then let it stand till the next day. Put it in your cask or bottles. To every gallon add a gill of brandy, stop it lightly till the fermentation is over, then stop it very close, keep it 1 year before you tap it. More recently, the old ladies who were noted for making good sweet mead, or sweet drink as they call it, boiled the combs from which honey had been drained until all the honey had been extracted, and then they strained it, and add as much honey as they can make to make the drink strong enough to float an egg. To every gallon they added an ounce of cloves, and then the same of allspice, and half an ounce of coriander, and the same weight of caraway seed. Sometimes cinnamon and mace were used instead of the other seeds. Others, who preferred the flavour and perfume of aromatic plants, boiled in water before they used honey, the tips of the sweetbriar, the flowers of thyme, rosemary, sweet marjoram, or any other sweet herb they liked, and finished as above. All or any of the flavouring ingredients were used according to taste. So that's the first volume of Bottrell. The other 2 volumes will be condensed into a single episode that will go out next month. And then all of that will be kneaded into the rising dough that is the Cornish supplement. See you next week. Your saga may vary.